We're talking about Bible Introduction to Boundaries. And we're going to review slightly, for those that this is the first time, just briefly review the first 2 points. But I want to start by reading a news article. I read this news article this week, and I thought, wow, we were just talking about that on Sunday. So this is from the, I think it's the Washington Post. But on May 7th, they write, a college student who raised nearly $500,000 for a Washington, D.C. homeless man says the money has now been refunded, a sharp reversal in a saga that drew widespread attention online. In a series of TikTok videos posted last week, Sinai Graydon, so she's a college student, explained she lost contact with Alonzo Douglas Hebron, the man she met in late January on the streets of downtown D.C. She posted a video of her getting his medication for him, paying for his hotel room, and the 21-year-old college student and Hebron, the homeless individual, were catapulted into viral fame. Through her social media campaign, she raised more than $400,000 in GoFundMe for Hebron specifically. The college student remained committed to helping Hebron even after, through the attention that she garnered, it became apparent that he had a violent criminal record, including assault on another homeless woman. Since then, the Washington Post reported on their story. Graydon said that she has had difficulty staying in touch with Hebron. After she raised this money, he became evasive. He ran through gift cards that she provided him and lost the cell phone that she purchased for him. And this is what got my attention. I really did try to help him, Graydon said in a video. I tried to transform his whole life, but sometimes when you want something for somebody, they may not want it for themselves. Can you imagine, I was saying to myself, I'm not homeless by any stretch, but if someone wanted to put $400,000 towards my betterment of my life, my goodness, who wouldn't take that up, right? And here's a man who struggles to stay in the same place from night to night, struggles with medication, struggles with other things, and yet when someone's holding $400,000 out to him, he just can't stick around. And that comes to this lesson. What is our responsibility? What are boundaries? How do we understand what we should and shouldn't do in relation to other people's responsibilities and our own responsibilities? Anyway, that news article, it was sad, but at the same time, it just illustrated kind of why we're talking about these things, why the Bible makes a point of talking about boundaries. And to review, when we talk about boundaries, we're talking about a derivative of the biblical ideas of, biblical ideas of responsibility and ownership. And that is the idea of taking care of what is mine. You take care of what is yours. You take care of it. But it's not enough just to take care of something. You have to know what is and is not your responsibility to take care of. And that's, we said, was the key. It's not enough to just be a really diligent person. There are really diligent people in the world who are crossing boundary lines and causing problems for themselves and other people. So you also have to know to differentiate between what is your responsibility and not your responsibility. Number 3 in that outline, boundaries in the spiritual realm may be harder to recognize because they're not physical, like a fence. A fence is pretty easy to recognize, the boundary line. But just because you don't see it as easily as you see a fence doesn't mean it's not as real. It's very real. And to look at that, we looked at Proverbs 4:23. The Bible says, keep your heart with all diligence. So there's these clues in the Bible to spiritual boundaries that are just as real. And so that's what this lesson is about. And we looked at this from the perspective of God and his boundaries. Now, we could have looked at this from a lot of perspectives, but to me, what I'm really passionate about when I look at the scriptures is I want to first see, okay, what is God like? Because it doesn't matter what Alan's like, it doesn't matter what you're like, what Pastor Brown's like, what some famous man that preached a lot of good messages about. What is really important is what God is like, and you model your life after him. And that's a New Testament principle. We model our life after Jesus. We are followers of Jesus. So we look at the Bible, we want to find out, okay, what is God like? And God says that he has boundaries. And we know this from Genesis. And we walked through 2 of them last week. The first one was this thought from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1, that God is this distinct individual separate from his creation. He is a distinct individual separate from his creation. And the main idea that we're looking at there is that some religious worldviews think that everything in the universe is one, and we're all one, and we're all kind of blended up together. They wouldn't say blended up together. They'd say something more respectful, but I'm just explaining it that way. And we're all one, and there's no kind of distinctness. And that's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible presents him as being separate from his creation. And that principle of being distinct and separate is the foundation for which of his attributes? Does anyone remember? Which attribute is built on it? His holiness. So the idea of the holiness of God is that he is above this world. He is completely separate. He is unique. You could say he is otherly. And he calls us to be apart or separate from the world because he is holy, and so we ought to be holy. So his holiness, it has a lot to do with this individuality. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of that, but I was asked a question after class, and by the way, I welcome questions. Questions is how we learn. You can listen to me talk and that not help you, but if you ask a question, we can learn through that format. So I was asked a question. I was asked this. Isn't emphasis on individuality kind of a bad thing? Like, isn't the emphasis on the individual kind of what leads to a lot of problems? And that was a really good question because I didn't clarify that when we talk about individuality, or sometimes they use the word individuation. I don't like that term, but it's one they use, individuation. It seems like we're talking about individualism, but there's a big difference. When we talk about individuality or individuation, we're talking about the process where a person becomes distinct and autonomous from others. So a child, when they grow up, as they become adults, they need to leave home, they need to take care of themselves, they need to get their own place to stay, they need to start their own families. Like, that's the normal process. That's what God expects. It's clear from Genesis 2, to leave and cleave. That's the principle. That's the idea of individuation. However, there is in our Western culture a huge emphasis on individuality and individualism, the idea that my experience is all that matters. Way I see the world works. Another way we see this all the time is people say, well, that might be what you think, but I think this. And we're like frustrated, like, well, I thought we had one book, we have one set of facts. Like, what do you mean your perspective, right? That's the emphasis on individuality, and that's not what we're talking about. In the Bible, we're talking about the good individuality is the idea of being autonomous and responsible. Bad individualism is this idea of anarchy. So we're talking about autonomy versus anarchy. Do you remember those phrases in Judges where they said every man did that which was right in his own eyes? That wasn't a compliment. That was bad individualism. Remember Satan said to Adam and Eve, he said, ye shall be as gods. Look, Adam and Eve didn't need to be their own God. That wasn't the program. They needed to represent God as individuals, not be their own gods. So that's bad individuality. We're not talking about that. So I hope that answers the question. I was also asked a question, well, what does the Bible say about turning the other cheek? How does that fit into boundaries? And we're actually going to talk about that. That comes in a later lesson. So hold that thought. By the way, if you have any other questions, please email me them, text them. You can ask them in class, but I'll just sit here and go, I don't know. I can research them and give you a really good answer next week. That's what I prefer to do. So if you could do that, it'd be helpful. Number 2, I want to keep moving here. Number 2 in your outline is this. God expresses his desires and will. God expresses his desires and will. And this comes from the fact that in Genesis 2, he put in the Garden of Eden 2 trees. One tree was the yes tree, and the other tree was the no tree. God had no problem saying, no, don't touch this. God was not a bad God. As a parent, there's this pressure I feel. That from, I don't know if it's culture or just my own insecurities or whatever, but whenever I say, no, don't do this, then I'm some sort of like bad guy. But that's not the way God was. God wasn't a bad guy. He said no. And God expressed his will as part of his being, again, an individual expressing and communicating with man. He could have told man what to do, like he told the waves what to do, and the sky what to do, and the stars what to do, and it was instantly done, right? But with man, he gave space. He created us with free will. And so he expresses himself and communicates with us as persons. And that is how we ought to be. We're not supposed to dictate our will unto others, right? That's the extreme. Do what I say. Why? Just do it. And the other opposite is, well, you can do what you want, That's not God either. God doesn't just say, oh, do what you want. No, he has preferences, and he expresses and communicates them. Anyway, we talked about that, so I'm going to move on. If you have questions, we'll cover that again. What I want to talk about is number 3. God sets limits on behavior by allowing consequences. So if you have your Bibles, turn now. We're going to look at Genesis 3. We looked at Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, and now we're going to be in Genesis 3. We're walking through Genesis. With all of these lessons, we're walking through Genesis. So in Genesis 3, we come to the sad part of the story where man and his wife disobey. Adam and Eve disobey. And now God has a choice to make. He said, no, don't do this. And now they did it. They done gone did it. What is he going to do now? Well, we know this story, but let's review it. Let's read it together, verses 17 through 19. And unto Adam he said, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and hast eaten of the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, thou shalt not eat of it, cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it all the days of thy life. Thorns also and thistles shall it bring forth to thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For out of it wast thou taken, for dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. So in these verses, and I think I read a few more than I wanted to, but in these verses you see God clearly giving an ultimatum to his people, and then when he's faced with a choice, he puts the punishments in place. And these are not God being mean. This is God being a righteous God. God being a just and truthful God. God being fully demonstrating his complete character. And so when God followed through on these conditions, he was showing an example of setting boundaries and allowing consequences. It was completely within his right to do. The ground. Who made the dirt? Did Adam make the dirt? It was God's dirt. God could do with God's dirt what he wanted to do with his dirt. The tree of life was his to take away. The Garden of Eden was his to grant permission to enter as he pleased. You know, when we do a lot of door knocking in Salem and whatnot, and I'm very aware that every time I walk up to that door, I'm an uninvited guest. I'm to be on my best behavior. And if they ask me to leave, I will nicely say, thank you, have a good day, and leave. Why? Because that is not my property. Just like the Garden of Eden is not Adam and Eve's. But while they were there, they were welcome to it until the door was shut. And so God, I'm trying to, again, emphasize, was not a bad person for removing that blessing from their life. He would have been a bad person, however, if he refused to follow through with his word. You see that? He would have been a bad person if he refused to follow through on his word. So, and it comes again in a practical application when it comes to us in our daily lives and interacting with people. You can't control someone else. Let's say someone is speaking foul language, right? And you have a personal standard that you're not going to put up with that. You're not going to listen to that crass speech or that foul language or whatever. You could try starting by saying this. You could say, please stop talking like that, right? Now, do you have a right to shut their mouth and put duct tape on it? Do you have no. All you can do is set limits on someone else's behavior by saying, okay, well, if you're going to talk like that, I'm going to leave. If you're going to talk like that, if you're in a corporate environment, you could say, if you talk like that, I'm going to inform our human resources department, which is totally within your right, by the way. You can only set limits on behavior. And you know what? That's what God was doing. God couldn't change and go back in time and make Adam and Eve do something different, but he could follow through with what he told them to do. And so I love looking at this story because it teaches us how, just as God set limits and enforced consequences and was a good God, in our lives we can do the same, ought to do the same, and if we don't, we're not imaging God. We're not reflecting what he's like. Let's go to elsewhere in the Bible. 1 Corinthians 5:11 through 13. 1 Corinthians 5:11 through 13. We see a really good example of this in the New Testament. First Corinthians 5 says, Apostle Paul is writing to the church and says, but now I have written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator or covetous or an idolater or a railer or a drunkard or an extortioner, with such an one know not to eat. For what have I to do to judge them also that are without? Do not ye judge them that are within? But them that are without God judges. Therefore put away from among you yourselves that wicked person. Now that wasn't very nice. I mean, where is Paul's kindness here? Paul's not being very, very generous. He's not giving second chances. And of course, I'm talking tongue-in-cheek here because you know that he did. And yet, that is sometimes the resistance. I mean, wouldn't it be crazy if I'm trying to think how to word this the best way. It would be unusual if you ever heard Pastor Brown or I tell someone that came in the door, "Get out of here." Like that would be what? You'd gasp. Like, what is that? That's not very welcoming. Why? Because that's not what we would say, right? But at the same time, there's been instances, I know Pastor Brown has had to do it here, I know I had to do it in Covina, where someone was coming with an ill intent. And they're not here to bless God, to love one another, to serve you. And it's our responsibility and also the ushers to remove those individuals from our fellowship. And that has nothing to do with, doctrinal issues. Like this is we're talking about behavioral issues, like threatening and things like that. And that is our responsibility. We must do that. And as Paul was saying here, look, if somebody's going to be acting in a way that is not imaging or representing the gospel, even remotely close to that, you have your responsibility to exclude them from your gatherings. I remember my brother-in-law was telling me about how they had in El Salvador. One thing they have to do quite a bit is someone will wander into the church services drunk as can be, and they'll have to politely escort them out because you can't be drunk in church. Well, don't they need to get saved? Yes. When you're sober, you come back and hear the preaching and get saved, right? So there's boundaries. We have to understand that there's limits and consequences for that. Another one is 2 Thessalonians 3:10. This is different. This is not about church. This is about ordinary life. In 2 Thessalonians 3:10, he's giving counsel to people who have family members who are not providing for their own needs. And in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, he puts it pretty bluntly. He says, "For even when we were with you, this we command you, that if any man would not work, neither should he eat." Now, again, Paul is not telling them to withhold charity. You understand? He's not asking them to withhold things that people need. What he's asking them to do is to enforce the principle of personal responsibility. If there is something that you can do for yourself, you need to do it. I'm not going to spoon feed you, is the way we would put it in our culture. And so in those cases, if you didn't work, you don't eat. In James 4:8, the Bible says of God, and I'll just quote to you, that it says, draw nigh to God, and he will draw nigh to you. So the reverse is also true. As you take steps towards God, he takes steps towards you. There is a relationship between our behavior and God's intimacy, his closeness with us. Does he have unconditional love for us? Absolutely. Should you have unconditional love for others? Absolutely. But should you also enforce and set limits on behavior as God did? Yes. Those are not opposites. They go together, as God demonstrated, having complete love. Some Christians struggle to set limits in this way. They struggle to set consequences because they feel like then by doing so, they are responsible for the pain that is caused. But the reality is that you cannot be responsible for other people's choices. You are responsible for your choices. Again, not to use my kids as an example all the time, but there are days where they decide they don't like dinner. And on those days where they decide not to like dinner, they go to bed hungry. And we're trying to go to sleep. We're singing our lullabies. Like, "Daddy, I'm hungry." I'm like, "Well, you want to go back down and eat dinner?" "No." "All right." I can't. We're not. This is the options. And as a dad, I sometimes feel like, my children are going to bed starving, and what kind of a parent am I? But the goal is not to make my children hungry. My goal is to teach them that life has consequences. If you're going to be picky, you're going to have to live with that. And God is the same thing. He puts limits on people's behavior, and he allows consequences to affect them. I remember I was driving home from Bible college when I was, many years ago, it was about 8 years ago, and I hate driving long distances. Ask many people, I'll tell you that. I hate driving, and I'm trying to get over with as fast as I can. Not only that, but literally on my way home, I am coming down with something. Have you ever had that where as you go through the day, it's just your body is like you start to ache and you start the chills coming on and you're just like, oh no, this time tomorrow I'm going to be a different person. So I'm driving up to Oregon as fast as I can, literally, and I am coming down with something. I am not all there. And what do you know? I see the cherry lights behind me in the rearview mirror. And I'm almost past the rice fields north of Stockton, or Sacramento. So I'm almost in the Holy Land, the green trees and the hills. So I didn't make it. And so the California's finest comes and sees me, and we're talking. He asked me, how fast were you going? And I was just like, look, I was going 90. And he goes, well, I appreciate your honesty. Now, sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't, okay? This is not a tip on how to evade consequences. But I was truthful with him in that moment. And was very brief talk. He goes back to his car, and he comes back and with the coupon. He says, young man, he says, I noticed that you have a clean record. I said, that sounds good. I like that. Yes, sir, I have a clean record. I've never had an incident. He goes, well, today you have a ticket. And I was just like, what a gut punch. He says, if I could give you a warning, it wouldn't teach you anything. I'm giving you a ticket because you need to learn a lesson. And I respect that guy. I paid my ticket, I did my thing, paid my insurance premiums for a year or two. But here's the reality. When you interrupt someone's consequences, you're taking away a lesson from them. I'll say it again. When you interrupt someone's consequences, you rob them of a lesson. And as much as I might have wanted that police officer to give me a warning instead of a ticket, because he gave me the ticket, I can tell you truthfully, I drive more responsibly because I would be hoping for the next warning, right? And so God's way is to not hesitate to set limits, excuse me, by allowing consequences in people's lives, even harsh consequences in the lives of his dearest children. Why? Because he is still a good God when he does so. So if God can be good, allowing consequences to his dearest beloved children, then so can we. You're not being mean. Now, you can be mean. Let me clarify that. You can be mean. You can be a jerk and do this. But God can do it, and so can you. You can be loving, unconditionally, and still allow people to learn lessons in life, especially when you're responsible for them. Number 4. God helps people within the framework of healthy boundaries. I love how Genesis 3 does not end with that sad situation. They're cursed, they're kicked out of the Garden of Eden, but that's not the end of the story. It continues in Genesis 3, verse 21. Let's look at it. Go back to Genesis, please, if you're not there already. I moved, so let me go back. In Genesis 3, in verse 21, we see this beautiful ending. He says, unto Adam also and to his wife did the Lord God make coats of skins and clothe them. Isn't that beautiful? Even though they were removed from the Garden of Eden, even though their lives were never going to be the same, and they had a lot of, just picture this, for instance. Have you ever heard someone say, you never know what you have until you don't have it? Can you imagine the months after getting kicked out of the Garden of Eden? Like literally going from paradise to non-paradise. That had to have been the hardest transition ever. And so they're living this new life. And yet God, he doesn't just stand aloof from them He doesn't look at boundary enforcement as a way to get out of doing nice things. That's sometimes what I would see, like, oh, look at that loser. I'm not going to help them because they did that. And then poof, I shut the door of my compassion, right? That's not what God does. God never shuts the door of his compassion. He meets them in their trial. He meets them in their difficulty and gives them a gift of clothing made out of animal skins. Did you see that? And that begins a long tradition in the Bible of animal sacrifices as a foreshadow of his ultimate gift, which is the bodily sacrifice of the Son of God for our sins. It's beautiful. He helps them materially with clothing, but he also helps them symbolically by giving them a hope, something to look forward to. That the end is not like this. It's not always going to be like this, Adam and Eve. It's not always going to be like this. And so he showed his divine grace within the context of his justice. God helps them with the problems that are too big for them to solve, which is their forgiveness, without taking away from them their responsibility, which is to work for their food, which is to live outside of Eden. And I think that's one of the most complicated choices we have to make as Christians, is we have to get into this new framework of working with individuals within the context of the boundaries that we set for them and show them love, but it has to sometimes take a different flavor. Are you willing to do that? Are you willing to apply yourself, your mind, your heart to that situation to think, God, I want to love this person, but I cannot do that anymore. I cannot let them do this anymore. God, what can I do to remind them that you love them and I love them? And for God, what he did is he met them with a gift. He didn't take away things. He met them with a gift. What a beautiful picture, isn't it? Let's look in the New Testament. Galatians 6. We see this again in the New Testament. Galatians 6. In Galatians 6, the Apostle Paul is teaching some principles, and he says this, Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault, ye which are spiritual, restore such an one in the spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. Look at verse 2. Bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if a man think himself, and I'm just going to, for sake of time, skip down to verse 5. He goes into some things. But verse 5, for every man shall bear his own burden. Now, which is it? He says in verse 2, he says, bear one another's burdens. And then verse 5, he says, every man shall bear his own burden. Now, what is it? Do you help people or not? That's the way I think. Do we help people or not? Do we help people when we feel like it? Or do we just help people with things that we're good at helping people with? There's things I like to do. I like organizing, planning, things like that. Do I just help you with that, not the things I'm not good at, like raising children? What do we do? Well, you have to do what... Here's the difference. I'll just put it this way. The word for burden in verse 6 and 2 is helpful to know that it's translated from two different Greek words. In verse 2, it comes from a word which is used to describe elsewhere in the Bible heavy loads or weight. This is used as it's a commercial term. In a commercial business, you have what's called freight shipping. And like at Costco or other places, they take things off of the pallets or with a pallet jack. That's like a burden, right? That cargo wrapped on a forklift pallet and that's taken off the semi-truck, that's the kind of burden. We're talking about cargo, that kind of burden. And then in verse 5, the word that's used is referring to a task, or you would say like a package, or like you think of an Amazon delivery package or something that you would carry on your back. They're two different words. Now, they both are a burden, but one's a humongous burden and one is just a small burden. And the idea is that there are sometimes people who experience burdens in their life that are just too much for them to handle alone. And that is we as Christians gather around them and help them with that burden. Jesus did this. Watch this. Jesus came as a gift from God to pay a debt that none of us could pay ourselves, right? Jesus came to earth to pay a debt that none of us can pay ourselves. And in so doing, coming to earth, he did miracles. He fed people, but he didn't feed everyone, right? He healed people, but he didn't heal everyone, right? And so there's examples of him doing signs to show that he is the Messiah, but his ultimate purpose above all things was not to heal people or feed people or to make people happy, but to make people forgiven. That was what Jesus came to do. Why? Because that is the only thing that we cannot do. And so God demonstrates bearing our burden for us by coming alongside us and taking the sin debt that we could never lift. And he takes that upon himself because he can. And as Christians, we're in a similar situation where there are times in people's lives where they're bearing a burden that they cannot shoulder alone, and we come around them and help them. For instance, just a lot of you, when my son was born, you helped in a lot of different ways. Some of you gave gifts, some of you prepared a meal, some of you watched my kids, some of you checked in with my wife and gave her phone calls, text, and all of you did different things, right? That was, having a new person in our family was kind of like one of those unbearable gifts, and I'm thankful for all the help that I received. But at the same time, there's still responsibilities that I have to do as an individual, you know? I have to get up. I have to clean things, you know. There are just things that are my individual responsibility that I have to take care of. And so the point of all this is that problems arise when a people do one of two opposite extremes. People refuse to allow people to help them with their unbearable burdens. You've met someone like that? They just take everything on their shoulders. They've got to do it all. And people want to step into their life and help them with those burdens that are too big for them. And they're like, no, I got this. Well, that's not what Galatians 6:2 wants us to do. We want to share the big burdens. And the opposite happens when people who should be taking showers, or they should be working a small job, or whatever their personal responsibility is, they are completely incapable, and people go up behind and picking up after them all the time, taking their responsibilities away from them. That's not what you're supposed to do either. Those are the two opposite extremes. People refusing help with the big things, and people refusing to take responsibility for the little things. So Galatians 6:2 is trying to put that all into perspective. Every man shall bear his own burden. There's things we all have to do. But then there's things that none of us can do by ourselves. And that's where we come together and help one another. So the question is this, Christian, can you discern the difference? As you grow in your understanding of personal boundaries, you'll get better at this. There'll be times where you'll have to sometimes make a choice and say, I wish this person's life could be better, but they need to go through this right now. And there's other times where you will need to get out of your comfort zone and get into someone else's life that's going through a difficulty and say, I want to help you. I want to be there for you. Can I run an errand for you? Can I give you some grocery money? You know what I'm saying? There's times you have to step into life and help them through that moment. And we need to pray that God gives us the grace to be like him, to discern the difference. Because God, he could in an instant. He could wash my car. He could put groceries in my fridge that every time I take one out, it just reappears, right? There's things that he could do, and he doesn't do that. You realize that? He doesn't do those things for anybody. And yet, God, at the same time, gave us the gift of forgiveness, free and clear. It's because he knows the difference. And so ought we. So review, just quickly. The big ideas are that God is a distinct individual, and so ought we be. God expresses his desire and communicates his will. He's not afraid to say no. Can we say no? Thirdly, God set limits on behavior by allowing consequences. And then finally, God helps others within the context of healthy boundaries. That's a Bible introduction to boundaries. Next time we meet, we're going to talk about boundary problems that come up when these things are not followed.